What happens when just get it done becomes the answer to ethical hesitation? What are we training ourselves to ignore, and what does responsible movement actually look like? Welcome to another episode of Reflecting Great. I want to begin with a phrase I've heard more than once. A good dissertation is a done dissertation. And I understand why people say this. Sometimes it's said with kindness. Sometimes it's meant to protect students from collapsing under impossible standards. Sometimes it's a reminder that perfection can paralyze. But I want to name the specific moment when that phrase landed differently for me. I first heard it during a roundtable discussion where I was questioning whether certain research assumptions were sound and asking what risks might come with that decision. The response was, at the end of the day, a good dissertation is a done dissertation. Now, hearing that didn't feel like encouragement. It felt like dismissal, like a way of moving past something uncomfortable instead of staying with the question long enough to learn from it. Ever since then, I've been wondering what happens when we hear just get it done, specifically in response to ethical hesitation. Because there are moments in our work and in our lives when a question comes up. Maybe not a technical one or a minor clarification, but something deeper that asks, is this the right choice? Are these assumptions sound? Who could this affect and how? And I think what we do in that moment matters because when the question surfaces, the surface in itself is information, not inefficiency, but a signal, and maybe the most important signal in the room. I think the danger is in training ourselves to override that signal. Because if every time that inner pause rises and the reflection becomes, just get it done, over time we can build the muscle of dismissal. And dismissal becomes automatic, and that scales up. And this isn't only about dissertations. I think this applies to almost anywhere where decisions have consequences: business launches, policy drafts, clinical decisions, engineering builds, parenting, leadership. The list goes on. Anywhere you're building something that touches other people, because habits don't disappear when stakes are high. Ethical reflex isn't just built in dramatic moments, scandals, disasters, or public failures. I think it's built in micro moments, in the space between a question surfacing and a pressing deadline, maybe. In that gap, something is being formed. And to be honest, when questions like that come up, could this approach or work potentially cause harm? Should we cancel? Should we delay? Should we rethink? These questions may feel uncomfortable, inconvenient, even isolating. It can feel like you're the only one slowing down while everyone is moving forward, especially when you're close to the finish line, especially when that question could mean revision, delay, changing direction, standing alone. And that's vulnerable. So I understand why just get it done often becomes the response. Not always out of neglect, but sometimes out of survival, sometimes out of protection. Protection of timelines, of institutions, of ourselves, because asking, could this potentially cause harm, is destabilizing. It slows momentum and introduces doubt. It might require revision. Sometimes it even feels existential, like questioning not only a method, but an entire field, an entire framework. Now, to be clear, the reflection is not a call for perfection because you can think through so many things and still miss something. I don't think it's about perfection at all, but simply about what responsible movement looks like. Maybe the most harmful response is the dismissal, because dismissal closes inquiry. It trains us not to listen. And once you stop listening to your own ethical hesitation, it becomes easier to ignore it the next time it shows up. Or worse, it just stops showing up entirely. The shift may not be changing everything overnight. Maybe the start is when the question comes up, don't silence it. Pause long enough to ask, why is this concern coming up for me? What assumption is being revealed? What consequence might I be overlooking? What would it look like to interrogate this just slightly before moving forward? Because sometimes the most responsible move is pausing, rethinking, pivoting, delaying. And that's hard to do when a timeline is drawing near. But I think it takes courage to admit when something needs a different direction. Practically, what that is looking like for me when trying to build this ethical reflex is something small. I'm starting with a journaling space alongside my work, not just documenting my results, but documenting my thinking, my doubts, my assumptions, the frameworks I'm inheriting, the questions that make me uneasy. Not because I've figured it out, but because I don't want to train myself to stop listening. And the first important step feels like making that space to listen, to reflect, to question. And the reality is sometimes we've already missed a pause. We kept going. We chose done over reflection, and we find ourselves on the other side of that decision. But what feels encouraging to me is that we get opportunities to try again, to choose differently, to say, I chose wrong. I made the wrong decision. Let me rethink this time. Because that too is part of that reflex. What happens when a question surfaces that threatens to destabilize what you're building? Do you silence it or do you let it breathe? Not to paralyze yourself, not to delay forever, but to strengthen the reflex that helps you choose integrity. What does it look like to train ourselves not to ignore that signal, but rather to choose responsible movement?